Welcome to the podcast. I'm Scott McLean. My guest today is Dr. Mitch Maki. Mitch is the president of Go for Broke National Education Center. Go for Broke National Education Center is a nonprofit organization based in downtown Los Angeles' historic Little Tokyo district. Go for Broke is committed to maintaining and contemporarily applying the legacy of the Japanese American veterans of World War II, including their courage, sacrifice, fight for equality, and love for their country. Now, I don't usually do this, but I want to read you their mission statement. The Go for Broke mission statement is to educate and inspire character and equality through the virtue and valor of our World War II American veterans of Japanese ancestry. I love that. Hey, Mitch, how you doing?
Doing well, Scott. Just really happy to be here with you today.
Yes, finally. Finally. This was this was one of those tag episodes. But we finally get it done, and I'm glad that you followed through. And we're going to have a good interview here. Now, about 30 minutes prior to this, I started getting the tickle in my throat. That it's the thing going around here in South Florida. So if I go silent for a minute, I'm probably coughing. So
Very good. And we'll edit it out. No problem. Yeah.
exactly. We'll do that. All right, Mitch. So first of all, where did the name come from? Go for Broke.
Well, just to give your listeners a little bit of context, during World War II, December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and it thrusts the United States into World War II. But Japanese Americans began to wonder immediately what would happen to us, right? Would we be treated like the American citizens we were? Two-thirds of us had been born in America, were American citizens by birth. And people like my grandparents who came around 1900 had been here 40, 50 years and were American by loyalty and tradition and practice. Or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common heritage? Well, we got our answer about 2 months later, and President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and that set the underpinnings by which over 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry would be forcibly removed from their homes on the west coast of the continental United States and made to live the next 2 to 5 years of their lives behind barbed wire. Now, out of this context of living in a concentration camp surrounded by barbed wires and machine gun towers, the US Army came up with an idea of creating a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers, young men to go and fight for liberty and justice halfway across the world while their own families were being incarcerated back home. These young men came from both Hawaii as well as from the continental United States. And they would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for their size and length of service. I mean, think about that just for a moment. Young men whose families have lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses, their rights will go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American history. Mm-hmm. And they were known as the 100th 442nd in Europe. And there were others who served in the Pacific Theater that were known as the Military Intelligence Service. But you are asking me about the motto, go for broke. And that was for the guys in Europe, right? The 100th 442nd. And go for broke, it started off as a gambling term from Hawaii. And it literally means go all in, shoot the works, push all the money in, because the boys from Hawaii love to gamble. I mean, if you know anyone from Hawaii, and my folks are originally from Hawaii, I mean, they love to gamble. It's like eating, drinking, and gambling, right? And so it's a gambling term, as I mentioned, to go all in. And while the guys would be gambling, during basic training, and then even when they're being shipped out to go serve, they realized that what they were about to do was so much more important than any one wager, than any one bet. They were fighting for their future and for the future of people they would never know. And they had to go for broke. They had to go all in because the wager, the issue was so large.
Very interesting. That's a great story. I'm all
And
about stories. I
yeah,
love
and and they
stories.
are, they went
Yeah.
all in. Yes, as you can tell from the story, these
Yeah.
guys did not hold back because they knew, as President Truman would tell them later, they not only fought the enemy, they fought prejudice because
Yes.
that's what they were up against at that time.
Literally two enemies,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, so how did you get involved in all this? Where did your journey begin as far as this is, because I'm pretty sure at this point this is your purpose in life,
Yes, it is. It
which
is.
is amazing when people find their purpose.
And Scott, you are right on. I am blessed to be able to do this as my quote unquote job, and make a living doing it. But it really is my passion work, and it goes back. I'm 63 years old. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. And born in the 60s, I was just the all-American kid, like growing up with my friends who were black, white, brown, and everything, right? And we didn't see difference with one another. And it was around when I was 10 years old that I learned the stories of Japanese Americans being incarcerated during World War II. And my family wasn't incarcerated because they were from Hawaii, and people in Hawaii, by and large, were left alone. But I remember when I learned the story for the first time, I thought it couldn't be Japanese Americans like me and my folks, right? It had to be like the Japanese from Japan, or maybe they captured some of the soldiers or something like that, right? And when I realized that no, it was people like me, it was my friends who were from the mainland, and their parents and their grandparents were the ones that were sent off to camp. Scott, I was devastated.
Mhm.
As a 10-year-old boy, thinking, how could this happen
Yeah.
in our country? How could this happen to Americans like me? Because I just saw myself as an American at that point, right? And it 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 devastated me. And then shortly thereafter, I learned about the story of the Japanese American young men and eventually the young women who would serve despite being treated like that, and would go on, as I mentioned, to become so highly decorated. And I got to tell you that I didn't believe that story at first either, because it just didn't fit the way Japanese Americans were portrayed in the media at that time. We didn't have leading roles at that time. We were never the heroes. We were always the very stereotypic uh, character in the background, right? But when I learned that no, this was true, it was people like my uncle who served in this unit that did such heroic things. It just filled me with pride,
Mm.
and that devastation that I had previous was just replaced with a sense of pride. Like, this is an American story. This isn't just about Japanese Americans. This is about the sons and daughters of immigrants who in one generation said, we are American, and we're gonna embody the very best values of America. Courage, patriotism, and service.
So I'm going to get to the foundation, but this is very intriguing to me. It always has been an intriguing topic to me, and I'm now I can ask somebody that knows more than probably anybody I know knows, and this is never talked about. It's never talked about. I saw a TV series that a couple years back, 3 or 4 years back, that kind of was revolved around that, but it wasn't about that. It took place in the like one of those internment camps, and but it's never talked about. It's not taught. It's not topic of discussion in any wartime movie, TV show, conversation. So my question, what's your take on that? Why? Why do you think it's just kind of the obvious answer is embarrassment, right? But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons, and there have been movies, but they just haven't caught on. There have been references in TV shows, and as somebody who studies that, every time there's even a mention of it in a TV show, I'm all ears and wanting to hear what they have to say. But what you're saying is so true, that this generation of Americans growing up and going through school now, they don't hear about it. And
No.
if they do, it's one sentence in the history book kind of thing, you know. And I used to be a professor in California for a while at UCLA, teaching some of the brightest students in California, and they had never heard about it, you know, coming up through school. And to me, that is a travesty. Not only this story, but there are other stories in our history, in our country's history, that we need to talk about so that we don't repeat them, and we don't make the same mistakes. And there's nothing wrong, and I firmly believe there's nothing wrong with looking at our nation's past and saying we've made mistakes, you know, and we need to rectify that and or address that, acknowledge it, you know, and certainly there are limits to what we can do, but we need to live up to America's promise. And that's the promise that in our nation, no one should be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the faith that they choose to keep. You know, and if you think about these Japanese American soldiers, wrong skin color in World War II,
Yeah.
right? They were from, their parents were from the nation with which we were at war, Japan, right? And half of them were not Christian, they were Buddhist, you know?
Mm.
So they were different in so many different ways, and yet they were so American at the very core of what they did and served. Um, and if we have time, I'd like to get into, in fact, our nation did apologize for this.
Yeah.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided a presidential apology and monetary redress payments to those that were incarcerated. And in the words of President Reagan, he said, "Today we right a grave wrong." You know,
Yeah.
and the strength for our nation to atone and address for its past mistakes. And that's true even on an individual level, right? None of us
Yes.
are perfect. We all make mistakes, and it's important for us to acknowledge that and not live in a fantasy world where we think we are perfect, either as individuals or as a nation.
So then let me ask you, what's the impact and lessons learned from America's treatment of the Japanese Americans during World War II? What do you
Well,
think?
that's a we could talk about that for hours,
Impact and
right?
lessons learned is a
Right,
lot, I believe, right?
right. Because part of me worries a great deal that the impact is being lost. You know,
Yes.
as this is an 80-year-old story, as one does the math, we realize it happened 80, 85 years ago. And it's critical that we tell the story and continue to tell the story, if for no other reason to alert Americans that things like this can happen. You know, that based solely on race, people had everything stripped of them, right? Based simply on, and in fact, there was a commission hearing that studied this problem, and they said that the camps were wrong, and the camps were the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. You know, and I oftentimes share that with young students, and I ask them, when does that sound like? You know, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And more oftentimes than not, the students will say it sounds like today. You know, race prejudice, I think I don't need to belabor that point that racism still exists in our nation. Wartime hysteria, whether it's wars across the nation, around the world, or we are divided in our own nation, you know, and we need to, as Americans, find that common ground. And a failure of political leadership, and I don't mean this as a swipe at the right or the left, but you know what's happening in DC doesn't feel good to most Americans. It just feels so divided. We don't, there's no compromise, there's no let's do what's best for our nation rather than what's best for our party. And I say that with extreme neutrality on, you know, in terms of we've got to come to that middle. And this story reminds us what happens when we think we're above making mistakes and when we think that it can't happen in America, because it can happen in America.
Right. Now I'm gonna I'm going to touch on something you mentioned. So I grew up in Massachusetts, and I grew up a Massachusetts Democrat, and this is not a political statement in any way, shape, or form, but it's relevant to what you just said. And I grew up, a Massachusetts Democrat, and some years back, I took a look, and I said, this isn't this isn't what I grew up with. It's things started to change, like you said. It got uncomfortable, and I'm like, well, this is this and that's that. And then I would talk to my brother, and my brother basically hit the nail on the head when he said, "You're a Tip O'Neill Democrat." Now you'll understand that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're a Tip
Mm-hmm.
O'Neill Democrat. They really don't exist anymore. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could sit down together. They
Yes.
could have literally drink a beer together. They might not agree with each other, but they sat down together and they talked and they worked things out and they made things happen. And that's what we're missing in this country.
Scott, I'm about to jump through the screen
Yeah.
to high five you because that's exactly how I feel like. The Tip O'Neill Democrats, the Ronald Reagan Republicans don't exist in the way that
No.
they did in the 80s and so forth. But even more important than that, the ability to talk to
Yeah.
one another, just what you did with your brother, the ability to have discussions, and what we work with a lot of young people at Go for Broke National Education Center. And when I enter their world and see what they see, they're just getting social media that's either
Mm,
far right or far left. And
mm,
and it the social media vilifies the other in terms of, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're evil, regardless of which way you're looking at it.
yeah.
And I cling to the belief that most Americans still exist somewhere in the middle. That
Yeah.
yeah, we want a fair shake. We believe in freedom for all of us. It's to differing degrees. We want more government, less government, whatever. I mean, that's the kind of discussion that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would have,
Yes.
type of thing. But at the end of the day, we're
Yeah.
Americans, and at the end of the day, we know we got to stand with each other, because united we stand, divided we fall. I know it sounds trite, but
It's
it
true.
is so true. And I'm fearful that our nation is going down that path where um, dialogue, compromise, and finding common ground is not the priority.
Right. I agree 100%. And so let's talk about the younger generation. So, what does Go for Broke do to inspire younger generations to become involved in civic engagement activities? And what does it do to let them know that their voices are more important than ever in this modern time with social media and the dangers of social media, the weaponization of social media?
So we have several what we call next gen programs. We have our torchbearers, we have our journalism institute, we have a traveling exhibit. But by and large, what we are looking to do is use this story of courage, service, and patriotism. And I use the word patriot in this sense, in the old school way.
Yes.
Someone who believes in their nation and loves their nation, and not in any current meaning that you're far right
Which,
or
yeah,
whatever.
it's
So,
yeah.
but the
We're
idea,
gonna leave that in the background.
okay, right,
We're on the same. I'm 61. You're 60. We're on the same exact page, my friend.
right, right. But you know, so we at Go for Broke National Education Center say that this particular story that we're talking about is not a great Japanese American story. It's a great American story.
Yeah.
It's a story of the very best values of our nation, and people believing in our nation enough that they will overcome the discrimination and the maltreatment that they're receiving, in the hopes of the dream of our nation becoming that more perfect union. And that's what we try to share with our young people. And it's not our job to tell them what to think, which side of the issue to be on. It's our job to tell them, please think, and please discuss, please engage in discussions. And we're learning as we're doing this. We're not perfect at it at this point, but my hope is that we can get young people from across the country, from not just Japanese American young
I was going
people,
to
but
ask you that. Yeah.
yeah, no, people of all backgrounds,
Yes.
ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, regional backgrounds, religious backgrounds, blah, 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 right? The whole 9 yards to come together and share our differences. But as I keep saying, find that common ground. So just in October of this year, we held a torchbearer convening in Denver, where we brought young people from Maui to Vermont.
Wow.
We have different partners across the nation, and bring them together to have a discussion about the current affairs in the United States. And in particular, we had one professor from Boulder come in and talk about, what does it mean to have a discussion with people who see things differently than you do, right? In today's climate, the answer is we write them off. If you're not with me, you're against me, right? We've got to work on allowing ourselves to disagree, but still have that beer at the end of the day, like Tip and Ronnie would.
That is and I am not a pessimist in any way, shape, or form, but that's a very steep hill to
Oh,
climb. Yeah, as we both know. Yeah,
I
that's a very that is a tough cause, but I think it can be done. I think there's as my wife always says, the pendulum always swings back the other way. It
exactly.
always does.
And to be completely truthful, it's not like we're bringing the far right and the far left together in the same
Right.
room and having them. I mean, that's way beyond us right now. But
Yeah.
but we're talking about, average American young adults, 21 through 35, who've graduated from college or trying to make their way, or maybe they didn't even go to college, or they're doing a trade or something. So these are your, you know, uh, regular everyday Americans trying to find their way, and we have differing views. Whether the views are about abortion, whether the views are about immigration, whether the views are about the unhoused or gun control, we don't all agree. I
Right.
mean, that no one lives in that fantasy world, but we got to be able to talk about it, right? Because we all live in the same nation.
What do what do young Japanese Americans, when they first hear about this, what's your uh what is your experience with their reactions?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm pausing just because
Yeah.
I'm not sure, unless they're very young. Like if they're young adults, by the time they get to me, they've heard the
Okay.
story on some level. But I just did a workshop this past weekend with sophomores in high school, and it was a Japanese American basketball group kind of thing, right? And so they probably heard it from me for the first time in the detail that
Mm,
they shared. One, I think disbelief. You know, if you're a 15, 16-year-old kid right now, you were born way after 9/11,
yeah.
right? I mean, and you don't even remember a lot of the stuff that we talk about all the time. So talking about something that happened 85 years ago is like ancient history to
Yeah.
them. But once they get into it and they realize, wow, America was a different place at that time. I think there's disbelief. I think there's tremendous pride, and then they begin to question, and this is where I like to bring them to is, well, and how do we make America a better place today? How do
Yeah.
we help America to live up to its creed of liberty and justice for all and a nation of laws under which we all live? Yeah, so that's for Japanese Americans, right? For non-Japanese American young people, because many of them have never heard the story,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, it's not in the schools and so
Nope.
forth. Um, Again, disbelief, but surprisingly, a lot of pride. I've had a lot of Latinos and Latinas really resonate with this story because, for example, one young woman came up to me. Her father is an immigrant. Her mother is an immigrant, and she said, "These guys are just like me. They were the sons of immigrants. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. If they can do great things for the nation, I can too." And when she said that, I said, "Oh man, we hit pay dirt," because now this isn't just a Japanese American story; it's an American story. And as you mentioned, Scott, you and I are about the same age. And growing up, my mother used to always quote John F. Kennedy, and my mother wasn't political in either,
Nor was mine. Yeah.
but she loved this one phrase or a statement that Kennedy would say, and it was, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Yeah,
Epic. Yeah.
and we don't hear that
No,
today.
that's a good point.
You know, it's what's in it for me.
Yeah.
And I mean that's true in even job interviews that I'm doing with young people today. It's like,
Yeah.
it's all about me, and that sense of entitlement. And I don't want to be too ageist in this, but the notion of not what can my nation do for me, but what can I do for my nation is, that is embodied in this Japanese American soldier story of World War II. Is a nation that had really treated them like dirt. They turn around and say, "We're going to take that dirt and plant seeds."
They
You know,
rose above it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely rose above it. So speaking of Japanese American veterans, do you know how many are still around? How many are
No,
alive?
that there isn't a roster, that
Right.
we. But I can tell you, I would be surprised if it's more than 100.
That
You know,
yeah.
because these guys, if you were a World War II veteran, you have to be like 99 years old in order to just, unless you lied about your age. And some of these
Yeah.
guys did lie about their age. They went in when they were 16 and so forth. But um, in Los Angeles, we have an annual uh, fundraising dinner that we call Evening of Aloha. 20 years ago, we would march in like 60 or 70 veterans. They would walk in
Yeah.
and thunderous applause. And so it was just quite the moment. This past year, we had five, and we didn't have a march
Mm.
in because four of them were in wheelchairs,
Yeah.
and we already had them up on stage. And I look at them and I say, these are my heroes, and I'm blessed to have them for another year or two. But we are very close to that point where we will have no more World War II veterans of any background,
Yeah.
right? And because all of these guys and women are heroes to us. It was a different time and a different place. And uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I think if nothing else, what I would want your listeners to just really reflect on is we have another year or two, maybe three, if we're a little bit lucky, to cherish these men and women, and to thank them for helping us become who we are.
That's great perspective right there.
In Japanese, there's a saying, "Okage sama de," because of you, I am.
Mm.
And that's the feeling that we have about our veterans. Not only our Japanese American veterans, but all
Right.
of our American military veterans. Because of you, because of what you did and sacrificed, I can live the life that I live today. You know,
Yeah.
um, if you think about it, here I am. Before I was in this position, I was in the university setting, and I've written articles and books about this very topic, about the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II. My father couldn't buy a house in certain places, couldn't get a job in certain places, couldn't do so many different things because he was Japanese American, right? And his generation, he served in the Korean War, but because he was a little too young for the World War II. But his generation changed everything so that somebody my age could have a career talking about
Yeah.
that. And then my son doesn't even have to think about it in the same way.
Yeah.
He's going on to become a physical therapist, and he doesn't think about himself as a Japanese American physical therapist. He just thinks of himself as a physical therapist.
There you go. I was blessed and lucky enough to early in this podcast, probably in the first 10 episodes, I got to interview a veteran that served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And what you just said actually really put it when I said great perspective, that yeah, what do we got? 3, 5 years, may at the max, maybe. You
Right.
know, and that's I never until you just said that I never really thought of it that way. But
You know, the,
that's yeah,
in LA right now, we have three veterans that I'm very close to. Right, there, two of them are going to turn 100 this year, and one's going to turn 102. Right,
wow,
and they've all outlived their wives,
yeah,
which is rare. Right,
yeah,
and they're 100 and 102. That's super rare. And I attribute part of that to the fact that when they go out into the community, they're put on a pedestal. They're
yes,
demigods, right? They show up to an event, especially if they have their Garrison hat on and their Go for Broke shirt on. People flock to them and just treat them like the heroes they are, and it gives them purpose and it gives them a reason to live. And I watch that and I think that's how we should treat all of our elderly, right?
well, that's a
Because
whole
of
nother
them.
podcast,
That's
my
a whole
friend.
nother podcast. But certainly for the veterans that we
Yeah.
have, all of our veterans, let's continue to give them that kind of treatment.
Yes, yes. So let's talk about Go for Broke. Tell us about, you mentioned it a little while ago, the National Torchbearers Program. Where did that come from, and tell the audience what it's about.
Well, I came on board as the president about 8 years ago, and I realized it was at that time a 75-year-old story, and that unless we really got the next gen involved, we were just going to die on the vine, right?
Yeah.
And so I decided at that point we need to have a uh, next generation young people's program. So I called about 12 young people that I knew. I got them together and I shared my very best ideas with them, Scott. I mean, these were brilliant ideas that I had. I'm joking here. I had my very best ideas. Oh, I'm
I'm
going to
sure you're just being modest, but
no,
okay.
no, no, no. Well, I said we're gonna have speeches, we're gonna have
Oh
presentations, we're gonna
yeah,
have panel discussion. And
yeah.
there's one young dude, right? He's probably like 25 at the time. He goes, "I wouldn't come to any of that," And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, narcissistic injury, right? My brilliant ideas. How can you not like them?" And I said, "Why wouldn't you come to any of this?" And he goes, "Because I don't know what you're talking about." And he goes, I don't want to look stupid, and I'm not into that." So I said, "Well, what are you into?" He says, "I'm into clothing and I'm into drinking." I thought, well, what am I going to do with that, man? But from that, we started doing in the Little Tokyo area in Los Angeles and in the surrounding area. We would start doing pub crawls where we would go to different bars and put on different events, have trivia contests. So introduce the story, but in a venue where the young people were already at,
Nice.
right?
Yeah.
We started a clothing line with one of the young up and coming streetwear people. So we had to meet the young folks where they were at, and then they started getting interested and saying, "Well, tell us more about this story." And then we also had to change the story that it wasn't simply about guns, battles, and bullets, because you can. The only people who care about guns, battles, and bullets are those who are really into the military,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
they're history nerds, right? But for the average young person, it's like, oh, that's a cool story, and they move on. But if we took the story and we said it's not about guns, battles, and bullets, it's about values, it's about character, it's about commitment to a higher cause, then they start to see, well, maybe there's some ties to what I believe in. And so from there, we started saying, okay, we need to reach out across the nation. So we started reaching out to partner groups that we knew across the nation and saying, send us young people. And we've been doing this now for 2 full years where we've had a spring convening and a fall convening. We gather these people together. We have invited speakers to talk about various topics. As I mentioned, we had the professor who talked about how do you have difficult conversations. We had a speaker come and talk about unhoused individuals, because that's a big problem in
Yes.
all of our major cities, right? And on one hand, you want to be a humanitarian about it, but on the other hand, there's a health and safety concern, and how do you start to deal with that? And it's not as simple as get rid of them all or house them all type of thing. And when we found that when we approach it not from a deterministic point of view, or we got to tell you what to think, but just let us be that place where you feel that you can come together, talk about these issues, and then dedicate yourself to go for broke, if you will, in addressing this either on a national level, which is kind of grandiose because that's hard to do, but more realistically in your particular city. So the young people who come from Denver go back to Denver, the young people from Chicago go back to Chicago, and they do their little projects, whatever the projects might be.
As you can, as well, the people can't see, but the logo, Go for Broke, has a torch. So
Yes.
it carries it right into the logo.
Right.
I
And
like
that's
the
exactly.
clothing line. That kind of piqued my curiosity.
Oh, I wish I had.
That's all right. You can show me. We're going to be in touch a lot more after this.
Okay.
I'm sure we'll be communicating
Right.
a
But
lot.
like and it's more streetwear kind of. It's
Yeah.
like hoodies and t-shirts and
I,
stuff the
I,
young.
I, I'm committing right now. I am definitely going to buy a hoodie.
All
So
right.
afterwards, you let me know where I love hoodies. So you let
And
me know
and the
where I
one
can
that
get it.
I think the one you would like is what we call the coat of arms. So it's a hoodie, and on one sleeve it's all the different emblems of the different units that the Japanese American soldiers fought in.
Oh, consider that one bought.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. So it's basically you're getting them to kind of learn about it and then pass it on. It's almost in situations like that, I believe if you have 20 young people come in, if one of them catches
Yeah.
on and says,
Yeah.
then that whole thing it's all worth it.
Right.
It's just all
Right.
worth it, you
Right.
know.
And fortunately for us, our return rate's a little bit better than 1 out of 20. But
No,
you
yeah,
you're
that's
not,
great.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're not going to get everybody, right? But
Yeah.
if you get people who say, yeah, I want, and the term we use is, I want to be civically engaged. I want to be engaged with community, whatever that means to them, right? Um, and I want to do it in a way that serves a cause larger than myself.
So where does the Go for Broke Journalism Institute fit into that? Are they kind of connected in
Um, it, in
sense?
kind of a loose way, and
Yeah.
the journalism program is something that we just recently started. We work with a downtown magnet high school in Los Angeles, so we're looking at ways of expanding this program to other high schools and so forth. But basically, what we did is we take juniors from this high school who are interested in journalism, either as kind of a profession that they may want to pursue, or just they like writing. We gather them for an intensive during the summer. We provide them with top-notch journalist mentors, people from the LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, the local news TV stations. So these are like celebrity journalists
Yeah.
coming in and doing presentations, and then they mentor them one-on-one. But the very first thing we do is we teach them the Japanese American soldier story of World
There
War
you
II.
go.
So
Yeah.
I do the presentation because these kids have never heard of it, right? And these kids, none of them are Japanese American because they're all coming from inner city LA. So they learn the story, and then we give them assignment. Take this World War II story and apply it to today in whatever way, shape, or form you want to do it. So some of them talk about, oh, so and so became a nurse in World War II. I'm going to become a nurse in 2024. So it can be as personal as that. Or others get a little bit more conceptual and they say, racism 85 years ago, racism today, and but whatever they can do or interest them to make a connection with the past to the present, and that way they learn the story, but their report or their journalistic piece isn't supposed to be a book report or a history report. It's just the foundation to talk about something that's important to them.
And it can lead to college or
So about 2 years ago, we had a young woman. She came in. She did uh, a story on a guy named Kazuo Masuda, and I'd love to tell you that story in a second. But she did this journalistic piece on Kazuo Masuda, and based on that, she got invited to the USC, University of Southern California Journalism Institute, which is really big
wow.
time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the following year, she went to that program because she used her Kazuo Masuda piece as her application, and she's graduating from high school and hopefully going on to college, and will be looking at becoming a journalism major.
Wow.
So we're planting those seeds. So
So tell me about
okay,
her
so
her subject matter.
right, so during World War II, there was a soldier named Kazuo Masuda, and a reporter asked him, "Why are you fighting for America when your family is in a camp?" His family was in Gila River Camp in Arizona, and his answer was the answer that I think most Americans, most of the Japanese Americans at that time would have given, which was, "Because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America." Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Kazuo Masuda and the thousands of other Japanese American soldiers understood that in 1943, 1944, 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. 2 weeks after he said that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for America in Italy. Now, fast forward 40 years later, it's the 1980s, and the redress bill that I had told you about has passed the House. This incredible, we called it the impossible dream of ever getting an apology, let alone money. But this impossible dream passes the House on September 17th, 1987. 7 months later, it passes the Senate. It's only one signature away from becoming law, and that's, of course, the President of the United States, right? And in 1988, the President of the United States was none other than Ronald
Ronald
Reagan,
Reagan. Yeah.
right? And for your viewers or listeners who remember, Ronald Reagan was a very conservative president. And there were many of us, myself included, who thought there's no way Ronald Reagan is going to sign this bill. It's just a little bit too progressive or a little bit too left, whatever you want to say, to fit, his political viewpoint. But the thing about Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with him or not, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He
He
had the
was.
ability he had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. The opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands, right? So the question, Scott, became, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would get him to understand this whole issue on a very personal level and align it with his political viewpoint? And Ronald Reagan believed that America could be multicultural, that people could come from around the world and become Americans eventually. Well, go back now to Kazuo Masuda. His family, he's been killed in battle. His family is released from camp at the end of the war, and they want to move back home to Santa Ana, California. They go back to Santa Ana, California, and they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, and threats of bodily harm, right? And the Army realizes this is a PR fiasco. One of our own fallen soldiers or one of our own heroes, his own family can't move back home. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. And they bestow upon his sister the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest medal. Among those officers on that day was a young white American captain named Ronald Reagan.
Ah.
And that night they had a convention dinner, a rally, and Captain Ronald Reagan addresses the audience, and the Masuda family is there. And what Captain Reagan says at the time is, the blood that has soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks. You can't script this any
No,
better,
that's
right?
amazing.
So that story was found, and it's relayed to President Reagan in the mid 80s as this bill is working its way through
Wow.
Congress. And his response was, I remember what those soldiers did for America. And it wasn't the only reason he signed the bill, but it aligned the bill with his view of America being a place where people could come from across the world and become American. So Kazuo Masuda's statement of this is the only way I know that my family can have a chance in America. How prophetic is that?
Unbelievable.
It,
And
it, it, it's it's an incredible story.
that goes right to the roots. And now, Mitch, every episode I do a cheap plug for my nonprofit One Man One Mike Foundation, and one of the pillars is storytelling
Yes,
and
yes,
how effective a story can be if you know how to really tell it and know how you're affecting people when you tell it. And
yes.
that's an art form, and things like that, stories like that live are proof that that storytelling is so overlooked. It's we do it every day. We don't think much about it, but it the effect that storytelling can have on anybody or anything can change your life. It can change a country.
It can. It
It's
can.
it's that
Yes.
powerful, and that story is amazing. And I'm sure people that are listening to this are going to go, "Holy shit,
Right.
that's
Right.
amazing!"
I mean, you.
Right?
It's the kind of thing if you wrote it into a movie script, people say, "Oh, that part they made that up."
It's they
Right.
made it up
Yeah.
exactly. So
There's
when
no way.
truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
And Scott, as you mentioned earlier, you and I will have more conversations, I can tell.
Yes.
But I really would like to see how we can find our common ground in our interest in storytelling. Because,
Yes.
in fact, we're thinking of expanding our journalism program to being a storytelling program. You know, whether it's spoken word, whether it's poetry, whether it's whatever, composition, or whether it's journalism, there's many different ways to tell a story.
I would love to have that conversation, multiple conversations about this, because that's what my foundation is really all about. And because it helped me. And
Mm,
I paid attention to it though. And that's why I said, wait a minute, there's something here. And so we will definitely have I can give you idea. I can tell you how we'd whatever I could do to help you would be amazing. That would be
thank you.
amazing.
Thank you.
I think we're going to be talking. Yes, we'll be talking a few more times at least.
Right.
So then there is the Go for Broke Plaza. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Well, you're unfortunately your listeners can't see me and my backdrop right now, but
But
in my
they can
backdrop,
go online and look it up because it's amazing.
right, we have a Go for Broke monument that was built in 1999 in downtown Los Angeles in what's called the Little Tokyo district. It's a beautiful monument. It's
Yes.
black granite. It's sloped to reflect the mountains, the Vosges Mountains of northern France, where the 442nd liberated the Texas Battalion. There are 16,000 names on the uh, monument of those who served overseas. It's just a very beautiful monument, but it's sat literally in the middle of a parking lot for 25 years. I mean, if you look at photos of it, and people ask us, why did you build this in the middle of a parking lot, right? And it's because and I wasn't active at that time, but the people who built it knew that someday we could transform that parking lot into something more. Well, that someday came to fruition earlier this year in February when we broke ground on a building that is going to now surround and embrace the monument.
Wow.
And this is a huge building. It's 330,000 square feet. It's
Oh,
5 stories tall. Go for Broke will have about 10,000 square feet of operating space in there. But we're going to have on the first floor legacy businesses. And what I mean by legacy businesses, these are restaurants and businesses that have been in the Little Tokyo area, some of whom have been evicted because the landlords wanted higher rent. And they are now they signed letters of intent to come back and will reestablish themselves in this area, and floors 2 through 5 will have 248 units of affordable low income housing.
wow.
So as for those of your listeners who know Los Angeles, we have an affordable housing crisis in
Yeah.
Los Angeles. We have a really a big unhoused issue, but we're going to provide housing, and these are not just singles; these are 2 bedroom and 3 bedroom units. This is for families, right?
Wow.
Where we're going to have about 700 individuals living in this building. And these people are going to be paying rent. They're going to be working class folks that are trying to make it. Yes, their income qualifies them for some subsidies that will help them get along, but they're making their way. This is not a housing unit where people are just getting by for free or anything like that. And so what we like to say is our veterans took care of us 80 years ago when they fought for our future. They still are taking care of us by providing us this opportunity to reinvigorate the Little Tokyo district by bringing in the legacy businesses and restaurants, but also to help the city of Los Angeles by bringing in uh, individuals of all backgrounds, right? So let me be clear: this is not a Japanese American thing. There are going to be people of all backgrounds living in these units, and they'll be learning the Go for Broke story too, because
Oh,
we want them to know that what's this Go for Broke Plaza? I mean,
yeah.
uh,
That's great, man. This is so inspiring, Mitch. And
thank you.
I've never really said that during a podcast, but this is absolutely inspiring. Like, Go for Broke is really like making a difference in a
Thank you.
big way that's generational. This will be generational.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
isn't that what all nonprofits strive for? Right.
Right. Right. Right.
And so with that, so Go for Broke, I don't know if I asked you, how long has it been around?
So we were founded in 1989, so we've been around 35 years or so, and it was founded by the actual veterans who came back and said, "We want to do something that our legacy will not ever be forgotten." And again, when they said that, it wasn't in an egotistical way of
Correct. Yeah.
watch what I did, or but it's the story and the values and the legacy that they embodied, that they wanted to make sure would be passed on to generations to come. And so they created that the organization in 1989, and over the decades we've been doing different programming and so forth. But as we just mentioned here, our latest is our next gen programming and building the new building.
That in itself would be an amazing story to find out that what was the one moment where these guys looked at each other and said, "Let's do this." Like, what led right into that? Like, what was the conversation? What was the feel? Like, what was the and then you flick that switch and you say, Thunderbirds are go. We're
Yeah,
doing this. That's see me and Mitch had this little nerd off before the
I get it. I
podcast,
get it.
and
Yeah.
that's why he gets it.
Um, well, I can tell you that opens up a whole nother chapter in all this, and that the one of the commanding officers of this 442nd unit was a guy named Young Ok Kim, a Korean American. And for your listeners who know, traditionally Korean Americans and
Yeah,
Japanese Americans, or
yeah,
Koreans and Japanese, don't get along,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So Young Ok Kim at the time was a lieutenant, and he was assigned to the 442nd. And his commanding officer called him in one day and said, "Hey, I know you're Korean. These guys are Japanese. I'm going to have you reassigned." And Young Ok Kim looked at him and he goes, "No, sir. They're Americans. I'm an American. We're going to do this together." And at first, the Japanese American soldiers didn't know what to make of him, right? But then he turned out to be, excuse my French, a real badass, right? I mean, he was the World War II Rambo, where at night the other guys would dig foxholes. He would just lay on the ground and sleep on the ground. The guys would sleep. He'd go into the forest and come back with two Nazi prisoners, type
Wow.
of thing. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he led by example, and the men just followed him and loved him. He came back to Los Angeles after the war, along with the other soldiers, and it was through his vision and inspiration that he said, "We cannot let this story be forgotten. Let's do this. Let's create this organization and let's build this monument." So they created an organization, and then it took them about 10 years to get the monument, the money raised, and then to build it, right? And it leads all to another important point, which is that people have oftentimes said to me, "Oh, so when all the veterans have died and they're no longer with us, then Go for Broke will just close up shop, right? And I said, no, we were built for this moment. We were built for the moment when the first person voice is no longer available, that it's now our responsibility to articulate and carry on this legacy and this history.
And there's always going to be veterans. There's always
Yes,
going to be veterans.
yes,
You know,
yes,
well, I should hopefully not a lot of war veterans after the, but we are realistic about things, and
right,
you
right,
know,
right.
a veteran is a veteran regardless. But so how do veterans are there veterans incorporated into Go for Broke, your programming, your I don't know, are you philanthropic with veteran organizations? Is there any type of uh what is it, collaborations or anything like that you
So
guys do?
certainly, the few World War II Japanese American veterans who we know of, we incorporate into our programming as much as we can.
Yeah,
Because as you can imagine, when we have a convening of young people, if we have a veteran just come by for lunch,
yeah,
there's a line to shake his hand and so forth. I mean, this is living history, right? Um, we also at the same time are very cognizant these guys are 9900 years old. We don't want to overtax them, but
yeah,
the guys I know, they're always happy to, I want to come talk to young people,
yep,
and so forth. We do work with other veteran organizations, either World War II veteran organizations, or sometimes they're just
yeah.
veterans organizations. um, and certainly the truth is we are a nonprofit. We're always in the business of raising money and trying to get people to become interested in what we do, and certainly support us through any kind of donation that they can make.
So that is a great lead in to what I was going to ask next. First of all, give the listeners a website they can go to.
Go for Broke. So GOFOR broke BROKE.org. And there they can read about the actual guns, battles, and bullets part of the story. They can also see, as you have, Scott, about our next gen programming, about our new building. They can also find out other information about things that we're doing. Like we have a traveling exhibit right now that is in Boise, Idaho.
Wow.
Uh, they can also go and look at our merchandise and look at our hoodies.
Yeah, that cool hoodie that I'm going to
That's
buy
right. That's
probably
right.
before the end of the night. Okay, and so you mentioned, we kind of touched on another thing, and every nonprofit. Now, it's a veteran centric podcast, and there was a emphasis, and there is an emphasis on interviewing nonprofits that work with veterans, or as in this case, inspired by and created by veterans and the legacy of their work. Um, every nonprofit wants to know funding, right? You Go for Broke is on another level because there are levels of nonprofits. They go from small to large to then you
Right.
got the big boys up
Right.
there, and
Right.
now the question is always funding. How do you go about it? Fundraisers? You have donors? Do you have what's that like for Go for Broke?
Um, any and anything we will do to get it done. But
Take
the, the,
anything.
primarily, it's a lot of individual donations,
Right.
a lot of folks who believe in what we're doing, but certainly we've received a number of grants
Yeah.
from foundations to do the programming that we do. We have corporate support, and we do major fundraisers throughout the year. So again, everything we could possibly do to keep the doors open and the lights on to continue to tell this story.
So you're the president, right? So somewhat the face of it.
Uh,
I know. Don't be modest.
as
It's
fearful,
pretty
I mean,
much true.
yeah.
um, so let me ask you this: what was it like then, and what's it like now for the two words that every nonprofit either dreads or just goes, ugh, the ask, right? You're out there, you got to put it to it, in the ask? Does it get easier as it goes along? Was it difficult when you first started doing it, or if you start, the handshaking and the what can you say about
The
that?
you are it is probably the most challenging part
Yes.
of my job,
Yeah.
but also the most rewarding part of my job. And why I said that, I just came from a lunch with a donor that turned out to be successful, and the lunch was like 3 hours long. I think what I've learned over the years is how to do the ask better, and how to time the ask, because it's all about timing, as is
Yeah.
everything in life, right? And when you do it right, and what I mean by right is the person fully is engaged with what you do. The person sees how they plug in to what we are doing, and how what we are doing plugs into what is important to them. The ask isn't that hard,
Ah,
you know.
yeah.
But it's when you go up to somebody cold and say, "Scott, we just met an hour ago. Give me $1 million, dude."
Well,
And
you
you're like,
sold me on a hoodie, so you're good.
"Yeah, oh, I didn't tell you the hoodie is $1 million, right?"
Ah,
But
touche, my friend, touche.
but if the timing isn't right, if you don't have that relationship, if you don't have this sense of common ground, as we've talked about, and that I'm not asking you to help me, I'm asking you to help us, right? As because this story, for whatever reason, that's part of figuring out how to do the ask. Um, for whatever reason, this what we do is important to you, and we're going to emphasize that. So when I do it right, and when I say I mean that as a team, because there's a whole team of
Correct.
people
Yeah.
behind me. I mean, um, uh, I often joke that it's my team that does all the hard work, and I just show up and turn on the charm, kind of thing. I pick the fruits that they labored so hard to plant, right? But when you do it right, and there's this feeling of coming together with that donor, and them feeling like, okay, we're moving in the same direction, it's very, very rewarding. And when you do it wrong and you realize, boy, I missed time, or I misread, or it's the fit just isn't there, then it's a learning opportunity to say, how do I do that better and not make that mistake again? you know
I I kind of work under this concept of good. So we had our first fundraiser, right, recently, and we pretty much just broke even. I think we made $40, right? And you get with the board, and it's like, but I looked at it like, good, good. We didn't lose money. Now
yeah.
we have an opportunity to be better and learn how to make it better. And I think a lot of nonprofits have to live off that concept of good, good.
And the fact that you had a fundraiser that
Yeah.
didn't lose money suggests to me that you had a successful friend raiser.
Yes.
That you are solidifying your relationships with these people, and relationships are so important to getting to that fundraising part. If you don't have a relationship, you're not going to raise any funds.
Right.
So,
Right. And the friend raiser, that was a whole nother thing. And I did very well with that
hmm
because I have
hmm
a lot of community from growing up in Boston to the military to customs. So I'm fortunate enough to have a large group of friends, and they really came through. But that whole concept of good, good. I'm not hanging my head. I'm not like, that we didn't get enough money. And we made $40
yeah, yeah,
off that.
and a bunch
It,
and solidified friendships. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Now more people will come, and I'm going to tell you about that fundraiser another time. I think you'd be very interested in it. It's all the whole concept of it was storytelling, so it's very interesting.
Ooh, would love to hear that.
Yeah,
Love to.
yeah, yeah. So, have I forgotten anything, my friend? Is there anything that you want to touch on that I might not have?
Well, you know, I think what we didn't talk about, and understandably so, is we didn't talk about the guns, battles, and bullets aspects of this. And
Let's
I
talk.
would, well, and I would
Yeah.
welcome your viewers either to reach out to us, or I'd be more than happy to come back on another
Oh, you're
podcast
going to be on again.
to talk about this. And because there may be some of your listeners who would be very interested in that, saying, well, what exactly did they do to become the most highly decorated unit of their size? And, I don't want to glamorize war. I mean, that's certainly not my
Right.
intent. But the courage that some of these men showed in Europe. For example, at the very end of the war, the Nazis had formed what was known as the Gothic Line
Yeah.
in Italy, and it was their last line of defense before the U.S. could just break through that and charge straight up into Germany and win the war. But the Nazis had fortified this Gothic line, and nobody could break through it. So finally, they said, "Let's send the 442nd to break through," because they had been having huge success in other ways. Well, the leaders of the 442nd went and scoped out the area and said, "There's no way we can do a frontal attack. We'll just get mowed down like everybody else, right?" So what they decided to do is at night sneak around to the back and literally crawl up almost a vertical cliff in the dead of night
Wow.
to surprise the Nazis in the morning. And one of our current veterans, Yoshi Nakamura, was one of those young men. He was like 19, 20 years old, and tells me, that was the first time in his life he thought he was going to be a goner, because he said it was so dark as they were climbing the backside of this cliff. They literally had to put their hand on the guy in front of them to know where they were walking, and they made a pact with one another. If any of them were to fall, they can't yell out, because to do so would give away their position. They scaled, it wasn't a completely vertical cliff, but it was very steep. They scaled that cliff in the middle of the night, got up there before the break of dawn, waited, and at the break of dawn charged, and the Nazis were completely surprised, facing the wrong direction because they were prepared for an onslaught in the other way. And within less than half an hour, broke that area of the Gothic line, thus creating an opportunity for American troops to start to flood through the Gothic line, creating the beginning of the end of World War II. Yeah, so that's one story, right?
Yeah.
And if I can share just two
Oh,
others very quickly.
absolutely, my friend.
Um, the artillery unit of the 442nd towards the end of the war was the point of the spear as they were pushing the Nazis back into Germany. And the they were known as the 522nd. They were the military unit, and they were used because military units do a lot of reconnaissance. They go out in front and scope out everything. Anyway, they're pushing the Nazis back, and they stumble upon this large installation, this large camp-like facility. They have no idea what it is, so they start going closer, and they see large lumps on the ground covered with snow, and they thought they were logs. But then, as they got closer, they realized they weren't logs. They were the frozen bodies of Jewish inmates. This was a satellite of Dachau that they had just discovered. And they flung open the gates, saving hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish prisoners that were still there in that concentration camp. Imagine the irony, Scott, of these young Japanese Americans throwing open the gates,
Ah, and what's
freeing
going on
these,
back home?
exactly, freeing these Jewish prisoners while their own families
Oh,
are still imprisoned back home. You know, Unfortunately, there's not a lot of photos of that day because the army didn't want that to be publicized, that it was a Japanese American unit that liberated that
oh,
satellite of Dachau. So they waited to the next day when the white unit came in, and that's where we have a lot of photos. But there were a couple of guys that had cameras, so there are individual photos where you see Japanese American soldiers amongst these Jewish
where
inmates.
would those be found if someone wanted to? Would you
Uh,
just
You,
Google
you can
them or?
you can find it on our website. You
Oh,
can
good.
find it also in the National Archives, and so.
Wow.
Uh, and then the other in the Pacific Theater, Japanese Americans served, but not in units, not in segregated units. These were the young Japanese American men who could speak and write Japanese. So they would often serve as translators and interpreters, and like they capture POWs and they would translate the interrogation and so forth. But they did so much more than that. They would crawl across the jungle at night up to the Japanese soldiers' unit, eavesdrop on the officers talking about how they're going to move in a certain direction in the morning, and then crawl back across the jungle and tell the American troops, "Oh, the Japanese are coming this way or they're coming that way." And so the Marines that were there were just waiting for them. And even General MacArthur talked about how no military unit was ever better prepared than the U.S. troops because of the intelligence that Japanese American soldiers would provide. But the one story that I love to tell is there was a story of a Japanese American soldier. He was in a unit, and imagine, at least with the 442nd in Europe, you're amongst all these other Japanese Americans, because it's a segregated unit. In the Pacific theater, you're the only one. So you're a sole Japanese American translator attached to a military, a Marine unit or so forth. And initially, the Marines didn't know what to make of these guys, right? It's like, hey, that's the enemy, right? And so they had to prove themselves to their fellow soldiers. And towards the end of the war, as the U.S. troops were taking over all the different islands, they landed on Saipan, and they started pushing the Japanese troops to the north. And the Japanese troops would oftentimes take civilians as hostages and go into caves and hole up in the caves and either execute the civilians or use them to get out. Well, the U.S. troops had pushed them to the north of this island in Saipan, and there were about 8 Japanese troops that had taken about 100 civilians hostages, and they were holed up in a cave. And the Marines were just going to wait them out, and then they were going to see if they could go in there and maybe have a firefight or whatever. But Bob Kubo, who was the interpreter, said, "No, I've seen too many of our young men die. Young American men, white soldiers." He said, "Too many of them have died. I'm going in there. I'm going to talk them out." And his own commanding officer said, "I don't think that's a good idea." But he goes, "No, I'll go in." And the commanding officer said, "At least take a pistol." So they had a pistol in his boot or something. But as the story goes, they lowered him into the cave, and he walks into the cave, and he said within 10 seconds, he's surrounded by 8 soldiers, guns drawn. He spoke to them in Japanese, talked to them about, how they needed to surrender, to let the civilians go. And, the Japanese soldiers were questioning him. How can you fight for the Americans? You're a traitor. And he said, I fight for my emperor. I fight for my nation, and my nation is America. So, putting it in terms that the Japanese soldiers would understand. Finally, they said to him, "Okay, we're going to talk about it. We're going to let you go, but we're going to talk about it, whether we're going to come out at 2:00 or whatever the time is. Either we're going to come out, or if we don't come out, that means we're all dead in here," right? So they let him go. Bob goes back to his troop. They're waiting patiently. 2:00, the civilians start filing out of the cave, and the Japanese soldiers try to file out with them to escape.
Oh,
But
yeah. The
they got
mix-in.
caught,
Yeah.
and so forth. But again, the amount of courage that took, the amount
Yeah.
of heroism that took, and it wasn't self-serving, obviously, because he put himself in harm's way to protect not only the civilians that were in the cave, but his own fellow American soldiers,
Yeah.
right? So these are just tidbits of the stories
Wow.
that we tell. That and that, so I don't mean to belittle the guns, battles, and bullets aspect of it, because
Oh,
that
no,
is,
it's a big part of it.
yeah,
It's part of the history of it.
and
Absolutely.
that's what's so inspiring,
Yeah.
that it's a combination of be inspired by their courage, but then be inspired to, you don't have to pick up a gun now. You have to pick up, a petition or whatever it is
Yeah.
to get your viewpoint across.
Wow. So everyone always says this, but this rings true for this is Why wasn't that a movie? Why isn't that because that story is just, you know,
So
so
there's a
unique.
yeah, and there've been there was a Go for Broke movie in the 50s, but with Van Johnson, it just never made it super big, right?
Yeah.
Um, there is a book out now called Facing the Mountain,
I was gonna ask
and
you about publications on it.
okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's a book out called Facing the Mountain, which is kind of a um, historical fiction. I mean, the author Daniel Brown uses a lot of real stories, and he just massages them into a novel. And he wrote a book about the boys in the boat. About I think it's an English crew team that was made into a movie. So there's talk about them making that into a movie. You
That would
know,
be an amazing
um,
movie. Yeah.
I think part of it is, and this is not so true now, but it's probably true more in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that you didn't see a lot of movies about Americans who were not white,
Right.
in those decades, right?
You're right.
Um, More recently, in the 2000s and 2010s, you start to see movies about ethnic Americans and their contributions to America. So I'm hoping that, you know, there will be a time when we can really celebrate what all of our communities have done to make America what it is today.
I think that's Veterans Day. I think because we all come together on Veterans Day.
Yeah.
And people don't really get this. The 90%, and I can't say 100% of anything, but 90% of veterans could give a shit who's next to them. That's a fact.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't, but unfortunately, it gets maybe portrayed differently, or it gets in recent times has been put into another perspective that doesn't make sense to me because I lived it for 10 years. But yeah, we're all the same when we put the uniform on. That's abs. I mean, it's cliche, but it's true.
Right.
And the people you
One
were
of
talking about, the men you were talking about, are perfect examples of that.
Yes, yes. One of the veterans, one of our veterans was telling me, one of the values he learned during that time is you look to your left, you look to your right, and you take care of each other.
That's right.
And that's not true just for Japanese American veterans.
No,
That's true for all the veterans, right?
yeah,
You look to your left, you look to your right, you take care of each other because that, in the end, that's all you have. And
yeah.
in truth, that's true for us in America today. Let's look to the left, let's look to the right, because in the end, that's all we have is each other. Because nobody's going to come from outside our nation to save us,
No,
right?
no. That's truer words haven't been spoken. Uh, well, anything else? We got time. I'm not. Is there something you want to touch on? I I,
No, no,
I don't want to miss anything on this. This is
okay.
why.
Well, and as I mentioned to you, I would be happy to come back on, possibly bring a
Yes,
torchbearer or two, or bring a veteran, whatever
yes.
you think might be of interest. But I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, Scott. One, this has been delightful. It's been fun, and the time has just flown by. But thank you for giving platform to this story as well as to the other guests that you have, and the work that you do is very meaningful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And there's no end in sight. This is I'm going for broke, Mitch.
I
Going
love it.
for broke.
You do that. You do that.
So, all right, I have to say this is being recorded on December 20th, and I truly mean this when I say this was an early Christmas present for me. This was an amazing interview. This is
Thank you.
fun. I got to talk to another nerd, another comic book. He's a Marvel nerd. I like Batman personally. We discussed that before the podcast, but Mitch, I look forward to keeping in touch with you. I think we have things that we can do together, even though I'm on the total opposite side of the country. We can still work together, and any help I can give you in your foundation, just reach out to me if you want to promote something. Whenever you want to come back on, you let me know, and you got the spot. I'll bump you to the top of the list.
Oh,
I don't care what the people behind you say. It's my podcast.
thank you so much, Scott. And again, it's been a true delight. And so
Yes.
to your listeners, happy holidays, and to you, happy holidays. And I hope you have a good holiday season with your family.
I appreciate that. And stand by. Let me do my outro, and then we'll talk a little more when we get done. Well,
all right.
We built another bridge today, as this podcast was built to do. And I want to thank Mitch Maki, Dr. Mitch Maki, for coming on and being such a great interview. I want to thank you for listening. If you liked it, share it. If you want to find out what platforms we're on all of them. I could go down the list: Apple, Amazon, Spotify. We're on all of them. So if you like it, share it. And as I always say, thank you for supporting me and listening. It's caught some legs and caught some traction, and the podcast is being productive. And that's what I did it for. And that's, you can't give a podcaster a better gift than that. So, and also listen to the end of the episode. There's a good public service announcement for veterans, families of veterans, and civilians in general. It's about 211 and 988. It's 30 seconds long. Just give it a listen. It's very informative. And with all that, I will see you next Monday, or you'll hear me next Monday with a new episode.